We're going to talk about smart cities today and big data and the whole discussion of what we can and cannot do with data in cities and building various models and tools and software to improve the life of cities and improve their functioning. And I have a fantastic panel with us today that's going to be able to touch upon these issues at various scales. At my immediate right is Jen Pahlka, who is, of course, the founder of Code for America, and just finished a stint as the Deputy Chief Technology Officer in the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy. Before that, she ran the Game Developers Conference at CMP Media for 8 years, and she also helped organize the Web 2.0 and Gov 2.0 events for TechWeb in conjunction with O'Reilly Media. To her right is Guru Banavar, who is Vice President of Cognitive Computing at IBM Research, where he's responsible for creating the next generation of cognitive systems in the Watson family. And I speak as someone who got to spar against Watson on Jeopardy and beat him 3 times. You have your work cut out for you, Guru. He also worked with Rio de Janeiro officials to build the City Operations Center in Rio de Janeiro, which is currently running full tilt, I imagine, so we're going to talk a bit about that. And he also recently served on Governor Cuomo's commission for improving New York State's resilience against natural disasters in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. And then finally, on the end, my partner in crime at this conference on multiple events is Luis Bettencourt, who is a professor of complex systems at the Santa Fe Institute, where he's focused on cities and urbanization, working in the sort of subfield that's emerging called the science of cities. He is trained as a theoretical physicist and is best known for his work with Geoffrey West on their papers, influential papers, showing about how cities scale, and particularly in research showing that cities seem to have universal properties regardless of culture or history. And so we can talk about cities at all sorts of scales today. I guess the first question, I want to address each of you in turn to talk a little bit about your work. It's hard to talk about smart cities and big data if we don't have a real grasp of sort of the issues you're dealing with. So I guess let's start with Luis, and we'll work downward in scale from the very large to the cities, to the large urban scale, and then to sort of bottom up city hall stuff. So.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. So what I do basically is science. And what we try to do at the Santa Fe Institute, which is an institute for complexity, a bit of a sister of the Aspen Institute here actually, is to look at cities and any other problem, but in my case cities, in an interdisciplinary way. So you try to look at a city, as a social network, as an economic system, as a physical system, as a transportation system, all together, so that you understand a little bit how the lives of people in cities have all these dimensions, and cities as a whole express, their economics, their health, their happiness, or whatever it is. So, everyone has written about cities, certainly since Aristotle and Plato were sparring about what the polis should be. But there's a sense in which that we're going through a big revolution, not only because urbanization is sort of a worldwide, furious phenomenon, particularly in Africa and Asia, but also because we have data. So there are ways in which you can bring sort of the scientific method and observations to a system that's incredibly complex, but that you can start understanding and test ideas about. So I've been very interested also in terms of there's sort of this other. So maybe I'll stop there and let the others go, because I'll get into other issues if I go further. Okay.
Good.
Well, so I'm going to take a very practical and a very, maybe even, very operational kind of view of, what smarter cities are. Because I've worked with, many dozens of cities around the world to improve their, something that matters to make it livable and sustainable. So for example, right now the World Cup is happening in Brazil, as you know. And every time there is a major update on the City Operations Center over there, I get emails because that was one of my projects.
Talk a bit about the scope of the Operations Center. I'm not sure everyone's familiar with it, too.
Oh, yeah, sure. So that particular project, which of course is one of many, but it actually built on top of our experience from various other cities. That particular project was conceived to deal with incidents. There are either emergency incidents or even routine incidents that requires coordination across many departments in the city of Rio de Janeiro. So for example, if there is a particularly bad storm and there's a set of incidents related to flooding in the city, and maybe some streets are closed, maybe there are people stranded, Maybe there could even be some mudslides, in one of the more vulnerable parts of the city. Those are events are reported into the city operations center, and the city operations center, it turns out, has to coordinate across anywhere from 6 to 12 agencies of the city in order to deal with that particular incident. It could be, the city public, police, the transportation department, the lighting department if it's at night. It's definitely also having to do with people who collect garbage, because garbage collection stops when all of these floods happen and so forth. It's just very, very basic things that we all take for granted all have to be coordinated in a complex city, especially one that's growing and developing like Rio de Janeiro is. So we built this center in 2011 was when we first opened it. It's been in operation now since then. And we have gone through several major events, not only the big parties on Copacabana for New Year's Eve and so forth, and also the carnivals and all of that, but also things like the Rio 20, which is the environmental and city planning event that happened last year, I believe. So that was an example of what we've done. I also want to mention that several cities here in the United States have gotten onto this approach of using data and coordinated processes across their departments to manage their cities better. One recent example is Minneapolis, which just kind of started in earnest in the last, I would say, few months. The police department, the transportation department, the public services department, public works department, the also the events management department. All of these departments are now much more coordinated through an integrated system that collects data from all of those individual elements or subsystems within the city, and they have a kind of an integrated operations view, which says, okay, tomorrow there's a big game, so don't dig up that street, kind of thing, which was never done before. That's just a very simple example, but it makes a huge difference in the operations of the city. Last point I'll make is that planning and operations are frequently never coordinated in cities, right? So the planners drop a master plan, throw it over the wall, gets implemented, and then they walk away to the next project. The operations people who are stuck with it for the next few decades kind of deal with issues as they come up, and they don't know, in many cases, why the plan was made the way it was, and they don't have a way to influence the plan. So one of my real objectives with cities is to close that loop between operations and planning. And even though I talk about operations because that's the more immediate practical thing that people worry about, and that's where big data is really useful, I want to get back to the planners, and I want to make them take into account the historical performance of cities and do it more incrementally than doing it like a decade scale,
So we basically need agile development for cities.
Exactly, yeah.
All right, Jen, please.
I think I was trying to figure out what's the best way to sort of tell a story. I think I'll just give a little example, and then you can understand what we do. So Mayor Landrieu from New Orleans is here. A couple of years ago, they were looking at a problem. Many people know New Orleans has a problem with blight. It actually predates Katrina pretty significantly. But they have a problem not just with the blight itself, but with the fact that you could not, Mayor Landrieu could not stand in front of a particular blighted property in New Orleans and tell you whether that property had been reported for blights, whether someone had been out to inspect it, whether it was in the queue to be demolished. I mean, there's about 7 steps in this process, but all the information about that property was held in this enormous variety of different places. And when I say variety, I mean access databases, spreadsheets, ledgers, slightly more sophisticated databases, but they're really all over the place. And he thought, okay, well, we're going to have to spend something like $30 million, and it's going to take 3 years for us to put this all in one place. But they don't have that money, and this is the reality in a lot of cities. There just isn't the money there. And instead he said, well, let me see if this group at Code for America can help. And what we do is we take small teams of folks from the tech industry, so developers and designers at places like Google and Apple take a year off, and they come work with cities. So we sent 4 folks down to New Orleans, and their job really was just to go talk to the 27 people who owned the little bits of data, put them all together in a really lightweight way, and they put up a website called blightstatus.com where you can click on any address in New Orleans and figure out whether that property had been reported, inspected, was scheduled to have a hearing about it, or was scheduled to be demolished. And they were able to do that in about 5 months in a very iterative, lightweight way. But it really, what it does when you do that is it changes the relationship between the people in the neighborhoods who are spending, in some cases, like half their time tracking these blighted properties so that when they go to the blight status meetings every month, they can advocate for what really needs to be taken care of. They've just been fighting with City Hall for years because they weren't working on the same set of data. But once you were able to say, okay, we're all looking at the same data, we all know what's going on, the citizens and City Hall were sort of able to work together again. But the reason I tell that story, and it's one of many, we do about 10 cities a year, and every project we do has just some level of working with data, is that there's a lot of small to medium-sized data that has an enormous impact on how we relate to our cities. There's big data too, but the reality on the ground in most cities is that there is a lot of stuff that is not even available in a digital form. And to really start having that smart city, there's an enormous amount of boots on the ground work that needs to be done.
Well, that's what I want to come back to. So, one of the ways that this whole discussion around smart cities and cities and big data is framed is going back to the classic Robert Moses, Jane Jacobs, top-down master planner, builder, operator, and then the bottom-up grassroots movement. And both approaches have strengths and weaknesses. So a question for each of you right now, and that is obviously sort of advocating a very top-down integrated working with government approach and a sort of very lightweight bottom-up citizen approach. I'd like you to critique the other side, each of you to critique the other side in terms of what do you think are the weaknesses of the top-down integrated approach and what do you think are the weaknesses of the bottom-up approach? Because if we're to try to build this as quickly as possible to deal with the challenges cities face, it seems like we need to adapt the best of each. So I'm curious to know what you think is weak about each other's approaches and what your technique can learn from the others.
You want to start, Jen?
Sure, I'll go first. I guess
we'll go cross-X.
I would preface it by saying, strangely, so our mission statement is we believe government can work for the people, by the people in the 21st century. And so we think of for the people as more of a top-down thing where government is providing services to citizens, and then by the people as citizens actually need to be involved. This is not a one-way street. And so the program I discussed just now is our top-down approach. Our bottom-up approach are these brigades where basically we say that cities are never going to have the capacity that they need in terms of technology and technical talent, but there are people living in those cities who may or may not, they're not necessarily going to go work in City Hall, but they will do this in their spare time. And so these brigades get together, usually weekly, in City Hall and help cities with their tech. So there's a real bottom-up approach if you want one, and we've had amazing stuff come out of that program. But I think the biggest criticism really is just that it's not a criticism, but the reality in these cities is that the data isn't there's huge data shame. They don't want to share the data because they know that there's enormous amounts of things wrong with it.
Start using data shame. I had not heard of that.
Yeah, I picked that one up
phrase.
from someone else. I can't remember who it was, but it was a very handy term. There's a ton of data shame. So usually, this Code for America sort of open government crowd would come in and say, well, open your data, and they would say no, and they'd be like, well, you're not an open. It's not about wanting to close it off. It's that they're legitimately worried about putting data out there that needs to be cleaned. Of course, our stance, and we can help them get there, is put it out there, caveat it, make it clear that this is a process, that this is going to get better, and the community will help you clean that data, which is really, really important. But the data shame is part of it. The resources, and I mean the technical resources in the city to be able to manage these systems is not always there. But I think our real approach is our real reason for taking a primarily bottom-up approach at this problem is simply that we believe that allows citizens to be involved, and that is core to our mission, that this data should be not only co-owned by the citizens and managed by the citizens. They should have as much access to it, if not more, than the institutions. But in most cases, you're not going to get good data unless your citizens are collecting that data. So the sister project that year was with Detroit, also on blight, where they found out a really, they were finding that these surveys of what was blighted in Detroit would take, they'd go do the survey, and it was still like 9 months to a year before that became actionable data that the city would be using in their planning department. They created this app that you can use on your mobile phone that also has a paper component for folks that don't use smartphones, and they reduced that process to about 2 weeks so that the data about, all the assets in a neighborhood is actually accurate because the neighbors went around and collected it.
Yeah.
All right, very good. Well, I would also actually start from the same or a similar point that, governments don't succeed unless citizens, are happy and find a city livable and sustainable and meets their objectives. So, in some sense, the goals of a smarter city should be shared by citizens and the government. The reason I believe that a purely citizen-driven approach will take longer to work. I'm not saying it's impossible to make it work, but it'll take longer to work, is because you need a certain level of investment and a certain level of coordination in order to get pretty complex projects off the ground, right? And once you kind of get these off the ground and enable the whole ecosystem in the city to participate, I think that's when the real scale and the real benefits occur, right? So as an example, I want to use, I want to use the New York City example, right? So there is a new center in New York City called CUSP. Some of you may know about it, the Center for Urban Studies and Progress. Steve Koonin is the director. And there's a program on urban studies that has just started, the master's program last year was, I think, the first year. The goal of CUSP is to create a platform, they call it a data warehouse, but a data platform really, which gets all of the department data from across New York into a common platform, because they are an agency of the city of New York, and they're also a department of NYU, right, and Brooklyn Polytechnic. So they are able to play this dual role of getting the existing data, creating a platform, and then opening up all the parts that can be opened up. There are parts that cannot be opened, like tax information or health information or certain parts of education information by law cannot be opened up. But every part that can be opened up will be opened up, I believe, by CUSP in this data platform. And IBM, I'm happy to say, is one of the partners of CUSP, and we are enabling this data platform work by CUSP, where they want to make citizen and entrepreneur and student and researcher engagement as one of their primary metrics for the success of this data platform. So I think that's a good combination of this, what you might call top-down, investment-oriented, because they're going to get some investment in order to get this whole platform started. You need capital, you need some coordination in order to get it all started, otherwise it will never get started.
May I jump in?
Well, I would say, Luis, I want you to do the meta-criticism also as well. So address any point you like on this, but I particularly like you to criticize both approaches in the sense of your work on the science of cities argues that we still don't have a fundamental understanding of urban operations to even build the engineering to really make effective systems. So I'm curious your take.
So 2 points. First, I'd like to go even deeper on to the bottom, so to speak, from the bottom up, which is just to give this example that came up yesterday in our conversations, which is that a lot of our work now in our group in Santa Fe is really with Slum Dwellers International, which is an international nonprofit who does basically census of slum neighborhoods, mostly in Africa and India. And these censuses are done, just as you're describing a little bit, by the communities themselves. So the communities actually take a self-census, they count their people, they decide to map the services to express according to a standard questionnaire that we developed with them that's international, the quality of services, amount of time that they spend doing this and that, because these are mostly poor communities, people pay with time, and in some sense to prioritize what they would like to have in terms of services or interactions with the city. And this comes in a context that actually is very interesting, which connects to a lot what Jennifer was saying, which is that actually what happened to these neighborhoods is that because they're informal, they're slums, often the city really doesn't know about them and often doesn't want to know about them. So for them, this is a way of becoming visible, of becoming part of the civic process of the city. And what is interesting about this is that historically this process was developed first in Mumbai in the late 70s and 80s. And you know, the usual things were tried, advocacy, protests, etc. Didn't work. And at some point, the nonprofits involved actually discovered that by using data, by basically doing a census, something that the community could understand, but also the city or the utility could understand, then they could have a much more objective and constructive dialogue about the actual problems. And this was really important because now the city, of course, could go back and say, I don't trust that number. And they would go together and just make sure that they got the right number. It might not have been the first. You know, they also have data shame, everyone does. But to have a process by which you go and verify a fact and then have sort of grounds for understanding the problem and then move on with the solution. So in some places, such as slums in African or Indian cities, this is really the reality. You're starting with very weak governance. You're looking for very incremental solutions to very complicated problems. And so this is really important. In our developed cities, of course, things got a little bit more fine. There's a sense in which we have services of certain standards and the improvements and the degree of what government can and cannot do is probably, you have a little bit more room for maneuver. But nevertheless, this is sort of the process by which urban planning is actually working in reality when it works well. And so you start seeing it really as a coordination of information. The information about need and what is there is really at the ground level with communities. So I like your example about Detroit. But then the question is, how do you coordinate that with agency and mission and resources from the city or from the utility or from whoever the player is in a way that doesn't bog everything down so that you don't basically have antagonistic relationships. So I think that that's the way I like to think about the top-down and the bottom-up, is really how do you allow them to meet together in order to actually solve problems. And I think the role of data collection that's rich, that goes down to an individual and all that messiness, but at the same time coordinates with professional design and solution making from the top down. That's the nature, really, at the end of the essence of the problem. But I was confused about this issue about top-down. So now to the more sort of conceptual issue of what is it that the top-down sort of mayor, city hall can do, and what is it that, in some sense, the citizens of a city do. And this is a very old question. Since this is an ideas festival, let's think about it. Really, where does this come from? So it's really about the role of government, right? And the role of citizens and firms and organizations and markets. It's the old discussion about the scope of government versus the scope of markets in society, sort of from the bottom up. So we should recognize it for what it is. It is that, okay? And that is a hard problem, right? But cities actually, I think, give you lots of examples of where both work and how they interact. So the kind of things that we see, sort of the control room approach, the engineering approach work well, are things like, trash collection, running the buses on time, running the subway, making electricity be reliable and, have all the, all the features of price and reliability they may want. And so all these are basically infrastructural services that require global coordination, do require some entity, usually the local government, to run, and for which usually and increasingly with all this data, you can get parameters that tell you what the quality of the service is. For example, how long are people waiting for the bus in the bus stops? How often are the buses coming? You can start nudging the buses, putting more on the road at certain times perhaps, such that the quality of service improves. It's a pretty simple problem. It's complicated. It requires a lot of data, but you can see how it can be run. But then there are other problems. When you start thinking about problems of education, poverty, even health along certain dimensions. These are what planners actually since the 70s, where there was the first wave actually of trying to run cities according to management principles that were scientific and that were being applied in corporations, where these problems came up, and these are called wicked problems. They're really problems where the causality is all entangled. Bottom-up approaches, what people do, what organizations at small scale do, are very important, where the time horizons and the indicators are vague. It's very hard to know how you should run your schools now such that people will be great citizens 30 years from now, 20 years from now. So we struggle with those problems. So I'll leave it there. And
All right, well, that's a great setup for this. So, Guru, I have another match pair of questions for you, but I want to start with you, Guru, on this one in particular, because is that actually IBM would argue that education is a wicked problem that IBM can bring data to. And I wrote a piece on this last summer about IBM's efforts with P-Tech in Brooklyn. If you're unfamiliar with this is IBM's partnered with a school there to basically do grades 9 through 14 for STEM education, to basically work with low-performing students and help them make them more college-ready. But one of the things that's coming out of that is that IBM is going to get the data from P-Tech, according to Catherine Fraze, is that they're going to get student outcomes across different cohorts, which are going to allow them to start building these sorts of models. So my question is and this is a question that I put to Catherine and to Michael Dixon at the time, is at that point, I mean, is IBM starting to redefine the Department of Education, and is technology going to start redefining the roles of government institutions? Is it not enough to simply say we're going to use big data to make city departments or citizens do better with what they already have in terms of institutions? Do we start changing governance? Do we start rebuilding institutions along these lines? How does the big data start changing approaches to governance? Because it's not just a tool, it's a tool that shapes the institution that's using it.
Okay, very good. This is a big question, and there's a number of dimensions to it. I would like to separate two dimensions out of the